Welcome to the 1-Year Book of Mormon. A non-Mormon reads through the Book of Mormon. 1 Nephi, chapter 16. Chapter overview. Nephi's brothers complain that what he's told them is too hard, and he says it's only too hard for them because they're wicked. They humble themselves and try to obey. Nephi tells us that he and his brothers and Zoram, the former slave, married Ishmael's daughters, that God gives them a magic ball compass thingy, apparently later named the Liahona, and that they leave the valley and start going in a generally southeasterly direction, that is, along the backside of the leg of the boot of the Arabian Peninsula. They kill animals for food on the way. The wicked ones grumble, then repent, and then Ishmael dies, and they grumble some more, even conspiring to kill Lehi and Nephi, and then they repent again. My thoughts and comments. There is a lot of grumbling and murmuring throughout the entire chapter, with the chapter heading as well as Nephi's chastisement saying that the wicked or guilty take the truth to be hard. This explains a lot of the Mormon mindset when the Christian rejects Mormonism and its teachings. I've seen many say that the Christian is rejecting Mormonism because they find it too hard. It must also be easy for one Mormon to lay a guilt trip on another by insinuating that something is the truth, and if the other Mormon doesn't like it, it must be because the other person is wicked or guilty. Verse 7 records that Nephi and his brothers and Zoram married Ishmael's daughters, but for the sake of keeping track of the chronology, we're not told when exactly this happened, except it was while they were still in the valley near the Red Sea, apparently. Verse 9 tells us that God told Lehi to leave the valley and go to the wilderness. Some time later, we're told that the people had spent 8 years sojourning in the wilderness. And while some Mormons think that this section is part of the 8 years of the wilderness sojourn before they leave the valley of Lemuel, others think that it preceded that time. Honestly, the Book of Mormon is so poorly written, it could be either. We are told in the beginning of 1 Nephi that Lehi leaves Jerusalem for the wilderness. But we're also told in this chapter that they leave the valley for the wilderness. So that's 2 times that they leave for the wilderness. So it's an open question as to whether the valley of Lemuel qualifies as the wilderness and thus should be included in this 8 years. The LDS Church favors the idea that the 8 years starts from the time Lehi leaves Jerusalem, so that all of this time is included in the 8 years of wilderness sojourn. This is based on the dates that they give in the officially unofficial chapter headings, but individual Mormons and, of course, non-LDS Mormons are free to take other viewpoints. While some parts of the Book of Mormon would seem to strengthen the case that the 8 years of wilderness sojourn doesn't start until some years after Lehi leaves Jerusalem, such as that Jerusalem had possibly been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar prior to this chapter, though again, that could also be claimed to be visions of the future. So much happens in the Book of Mormon from the time Lehi leaves Jerusalem until we're told in 2 Nephi that 30 years has passed, that it would be almost necessary for this 8 years of wilderness sojourn to have started with Lehi's leaving Jerusalem, so as to leave the maximum amount of time for the people to be in the Americas. I simply don't think that the people who suggest an interim of time, especially more than, say, a year, between leaving Jerusalem and starting the 8 years of sojourn, have thought through the implications, particularly in the maximum number of adults that would be available to, say, build a temple in the Americas, which was done prior to the end of 30 years from the time Lehi left Jerusalem. To show what I mean, let's assume that Nephi and his brothers don't get married and start having kids until 5 years after Lehi leaves Jerusalem. The oldest of Lehi's grandchildren would be only 25 years old by the time of the completion of the building of the temple, and most would be under 20 and many even younger than 10. Even if they start having babies in year 1 at the time Lehi leaves Jerusalem, that still doesn't give a lot of time for there to be many adults in the Americas by the end of 30 years. Unless I made a mistake in my calculations, fewer than 20 adults end up getting on the boat to go to the Americas. So, the later it is that babies are born and start growing up, the worse it is for the Book of Mormon chronology. Verse 10 introduces us to the Liahona, described here as a round ball of curious workmanship, and it was of fine brass, and within the ball were 2 spindles, and the one pointed the way whither we should go into the wilderness. As far as I can recollect, we are never told what the other spindle does, nor how it is that one points the way. It is later identified as some sort of compass. I guess it was some sort of magic compass, except instead of always pointing north like a true compass, it points in whatever direction they're supposed to go, quote, keeping to the more fertile parts of the wilderness in verse 16. In verse 15, we're told that they did travel for the space of many days, slaying food by the way with our bows and our arrows and our stones and our slings. Fair enough. Then in verse 18, we're told that Nephi somehow breaks his bow made of fine steel. Somehow I doubt that 500s BC technology allowed bows to be made of any steel, much less fine steel. But Joseph Smith probably was unaware of this, going off of the KJV, which also uses steel in a few places, even though the rest of the time the same word is translated as brass or bronze. For what it's worth, the Joseph Smith translation, which some Mormons call the Inspired translation, also uses the word steel in all the places that the King James has it. Very likely, this idea of Nephi being able to break his bow of steel, of even having a bow of steel to start with, came from, I think it was a couple of psalms maybe that David had sung, in which he said something about, with the strength of God, I can break a bow of steel, which, of course, is hyperbole. It's an exaggeration, basically saying God gives me the power to do the impossible, which means that Nephi breaking the bow of steel was impossible. Continuing with the Book of Mormon, without Nephi's bow, they suddenly find themselves completely without food, even though they're in the more fertile parts of the wilderness. And in verse 15, they had plural bows plus plural slings as well. And of course, the brothers do what they do best, and they start grumbling and complaining. Then verse 22 rescues the plot hole of why they suddenly have no food, even though they had multiple bows, because apparently all at the same time, all the other bows lost their springs. And by this, I take that to mean they lost their springiness, so they no longer function, rather than losing a part of the bow called the spring. I'm pretty sure no bows have springs. Maybe some compound bows, but that wouldn't be under consideration here. And then in the next verse, Nephi makes a bow and arrow out of wood, and armed with these, plus the apparently useless slings and stones, since they never caught anything with them, he asks his father where he should go hunt. So Lehi prays and is told to look at what is written on the ball, which now magically produces words. We're not told what was written on it, except we're told that it makes Lehi, plus Nephi's brethren and the sons of Ishmael and their wives, all the ones that were grumbling, plus Lehi, fear and tremble exceedingly. Verse 28 and 29 emphasize that the Liahona works, quote, according to the faith and diligence and heed that the people had. And this applies to both the pointers and the words that would occasionally appear. Apparently, this magic brass 8-ball compass pointer thingy could give bad advice or no advice if they didn't have enough faith. But now it directs Nephi where to go hunt, and he's successful. Verse 34 records the death of Ishmael, followed by more murmurings from his daughters and the others against Lehi, with them wanting to go back to Jerusalem. The verse would be otherwise unremarkable, except that it says he was buried in the place called Nahom. If you listen to Mormon, they will tell you breathlessly that this place has been found. And it is true, there was an inscription found somewhere in the vast Arabian Peninsula that had the letters NHM on it, but without the vowels, we don't know what the word actually would have said. There is no indication that this was actually a place name, like a city name, or the name of a town or valley or hill or anything like that. It could just have been a gravestone marker for somebody named Nahum, Niham, anything, or a memorial of an event involving the letters NHM. Perhaps it could have even been an old altar where they sacrificed animals to their demon gods. Who knows what it was? There simply isn't enough information about it to know. And then the remainder of the chapter records a conspiracy to murder Lehi and Nephi on the part of Laman, Lemuel, and the sons of Ishmael, with God audibly chastening them so that they repented. And of course, we must contrast this with the other occasion that we have in the Bible of God audibly speaking to a group of people from heaven, and that was at Mount Sinai. And it was such a horrible experience for them that they begged never to hear it again. Not exactly what happened in this case. Sure, they repented, but it was kind of like, okay, yeah, we heard from God, big deal, rather than the terrified reaction that the Bible records in Exodus.